noon lecture for December, the last for 2020. Today's presenter is Emily Gordon, who is the W. Curtis Worthington Jr. Essay Contest winner for the undergraduate level. This is an annual contest with a monetary award that focuses on United States Atlantic World History of Health Sciences during the modern era, that is from the 1600s to the present. Ms. Gordon won for her essay Differentiated Physicians, Physicians with Mobility Disabilities, and the Origins of Technical Standards. Ms. Gordon is from Park City, Utah, and a recent graduate from Harvard College, the undergraduate college of Harvard University, where she studied the history of science and medicine with a focus on history of disability activism and medicine. She is currently a medical student at Columbia University Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Gordon.
Great. So thank you so much for having me here. And I'm so honored to be able to talk to you all today about my project and my interests and my background and sort of how I got here. So my plan is to tell you a little bit about myself and then tell you how I became interested in this topic, specifically the history of medical school admissions policies for people with disabilities, especially people who use wheelchairs in the late 1900s. And then talk about the focus of my article that I wrote and submitted to this essay competition, and sort of the methods that I used of conducting interviews, going through journal articles, white papers, and then tell you some of the key findings and some future directions that I hope to take this project. And then at the end, I'm really excited to hear your questions and any comments that you have on this project. So first, I will tell you a little bit about how I became interested in disability and medicine. So this was a topic that I first became interested in high school. Disability was something that had tangentially affected my life in different ways, where I have a cousin with disabilities, or I went to an elementary school where there were several people with disabilities in my class, but it didn't feel like such a personal issue or something that really affected my day-to-day. In high school, I took a class on the history of disability taught by a teacher who I had who got his PhD in disability history in the 1800s. And he taught this class and was a wonderful teacher. And he started the class by posing the question, what would the world look like if everyone used a wheelchair? And it was really a question that I hadn't considered before. And it changed the way that I looked at the school that I went to, the buses I took, the movie theaters that I interacted with, all the people I interacted with. And I really saw how inaccessible a lot of spaces were, despite the fact that the Americans with Disabilities Act and several pieces of disability legislation have required buildings and public spaces to be made accessible. So it really opened my eyes and showed me that the world is different than what I expected. And a lot of people interact with the world in different ways than I do because I can walk and don't use a wheelchair. And the entrance to my high school didn't have a ramp and just had stairs and was an old historical building and was protected and didn't have to make any sort of accommodations. So that's how my interest in this topic started. And so as Dr. Forrest mentioned, I'm from Park City, Utah, up in the mountains. I would flip you around and show you the mountains, but the view from my bedroom, which is where I am now starting medical school, is not very representative, sadly. But I moved to Boston to go to Harvard for college and knew that I wanted to continue my interest in disability. I, during high school, had volunteered at this facility called the National Ability Center in Park City that is an adaptive equestrian facility. So it was helping people with disabilities learn how to ride horses and have therapeutic experiences with horses. And that was really rewarding for me because I'm also an avid horseback rider. And so it was a great way for me to combine my interest in disability with my passion for animals and horses. So during college, I definitely wanted to pursue my interest in disability and discovered this amazing department at Harvard called the History of Science Department. And then I was trying to figure out, well, where's my voice in this story? And received a grant to travel to Denver, Colorado to do a project on the history of disability activism. So that's really where my academic interest in disability history started. And I learned about a disability activist group called ADAPT that protested inaccessible public transportation in the late 1970s and has continued their protests through today, and are a really exceptional example of disability activism because they really use their bodies and wheelchairs and medical technology and really make their bodies incredibly visible in order to demonstrate that if you have a wheelchair in the 1970s, you can't take the bus because there's no way to get onto that bus. There are no wheelchair lifts, and a lot of facilities were inaccessible. So they would sometimes even climb out of their wheelchairs and crawl on the ground to demonstrate what they would have to do to get onto these buses. So I was really struck by this incredible example of disability activism. And so that sort of started my interest. And then as I grew closer to the end of college and was figuring out my future career, I knew that I wanted to go into medicine. I'd had a lot of rewarding experiences working in clinics and thought that my interest in disability very much aligned with my interest in medicine and wanting to make the world a better place and help people and do good. And so when I was figuring out my project, I decided, well, what about if I can combine my two interests in disability and my interest in becoming a doctor and think about what does it look like to have a disability and practice medicine, and what is the physical practicing medicine? What are the implicit assumptions about what a doctor should be able to do in terms of their bodies? And when I talked to friends and family about this and said, like, I'm looking into what it means to be a physician in a wheelchair, a lot of them said, we've never seen or heard or thought about a physician in a wheelchair. It was just never the thought that came to mind. So that's how I became interested in this topic. And I found an amazing advisor to work with me on this project that ultimately became part of my senior thesis. And so then, as we sort of zeroed in on this topic of medicine and disability, I then began to interview physicians in wheelchairs about their experiences applying to medical school and then practicing as a physician in a wheelchair. And at the start of this project, I wasn't really sure what the scope was going to be, both in terms of the historical time period and also in terms of, was I going to focus on the admissions process, focus on anyone who had a disability or just people in wheelchairs? Was I going to focus on the admissions process or practicing physicians? So I connected with a physician in Boston, and she was not featured in this article, but she attended Harvard Medical School and was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis while in medical school, and was, because of her diagnosis and the beginning of onset of her conditions, she was not able to ultimately go onto a residency program because Harvard Medical School was not willing to write a residency letter of recommendation for her. And so her career as a clinician unfortunately ended, and she's an incredible researcher and advocate and activist and has been very supportive of my work. And she helped connect me with other physicians who use wheelchairs and other people with disabilities to talk to. So I started reaching out just over email to several people who she recommended, and also started reading articles online that were typically popular press articles about someone who overcame the odds and, despite having a diving accident that left someone using a wheelchair afterwards, was able to go on and become a physician. And so there were these incredible success stories showing up again and again. And so I started to interview some of these physicians who responded. And then ultimately started to put their stories together into different time periods. So there were some people who applied to medical school in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. I didn't really find a record of anyone who applied to medical school in a wheelchair before the 1960s, both because I believe there were not many people who were applying with disabilities during that time period, and also just because of age at that point, some of those physicians are likely not still living. And so I was able to find a sample of probably around 10 physicians who currently use wheelchairs, many of whom were using wheelchairs when they applied to medical school. And so the article that I submitted to the Worthington essay competition was specifically focusing on before the 1970s and then during the 1970s. So there were several individuals who applied to medical school in the 1960s who at the time were not using a wheelchair but had mobility disabilities. And this seemed to be pretty representative because at the time it seemed that it was not acceptable or seen as a natural career path for someone in a wheelchair to go into medicine. However, one of the focuses of the essay that I submitted is that despite the fact that while some of these people could go into medicine, there were physicians who throughout their careers became disabled and were either in an accident or in some sort of circumstance that led them to have to use a wheelchair. And the profession willingly accommodated them and made room for them in the profession. Yet the question of my essay is, how did that reflect on medical school admissions policies? And the 1970s was really a critical period for shaping that. So I'll return to what sort of happened in a minute, but in terms of the methods for figuring out who these people were and what medical school admissions policies were like during the 1960s, 1970s, and beyond, I turned towards the Association of American Medical Colleges, which is a sort of governing body for medical schools that don't necessarily set standards that medical schools have to comply with, but often put forward recommendations and suggestions. And so I looked to them because they were a critical player in this story and in developing the standards that ultimately were used in a lot of instances to reject applicants who were applying with disabilities or in wheelchairs. So I contacted the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, their archivist, to ask about white papers and if they had any meeting minutes so that I could hear about what happened if someone in it with a disability or in a wheelchair applied to medical school. What was the conversation like? And what on a regulatory body level were they thinking about when people started applying more to medical school with disabilities in the 1970s? And I was met with the roadblock of, unfortunately, they did not have meetings for their minutes, and they could provide me with several reports that the AAMC had put forward and white papers, but that was the extent of their content that they had relating to this topic. So I read all of the white papers that they put forward, and they did have several really important ones in the 1970s when they started to get engaged on this topic. So I used interviews, these AAMC, AAMC white, and then also looked through medical journal articles, going through the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, several prominent medical journals, looking for any mention of disability in medicine before the 1980s. And then finally, I tried to weave throughout the story the stories of disability activism, which was happening and increasing in momentum in the 1960s and 1970s alongside the civil rights movement, and was really intertwined with a lot of rising social movements that were happening. The story of disability activism is related, yet in some ways kind of separate story than the story of applicants in wheelchairs and disabilities who are applying to medical school, because a lot of these individuals, when I interviewed them, they said they didn't see themselves necessarily as activists. They were people who just wanted to become doctors and were interested in medicine. So for them, they were just fighting for what they saw as very clearly what should be right, their ability to become a doctor that shouldn't be limited because they used a wheelchair. So I also, this article interacts with debates about medical model, social model of disability, and I think really shows that when you view disability as a medical abnormality or a deficit in that way, some sort of an impairment, it can lead to a lot of these consequences where policy arises that ends up being exclusionary and not open-minded towards people who can accomplish a lot and have the ability to do most medical tasks, yet might not be able to perform one or two different types of surgery, for example, and have varied ability levels like any medical school applicant would. Finally, it also engages with medical education history. And my advisor is a historian of medicine and really helped me with interweaving this story with the history of discrimination in medical school admissions against people who didn't fit the white, able-bodied, male Christian mold of what was traditionally accepted as who should become a doctor, and the doctor that you see in old paintings and you read about in stories in the history of medicine. And so that story was also interwoven throughout this article and this piece. So in terms of the findings and sort of arc of this story, it starts before the 1970s, where few people with disabilities were applying to medical school. But as I mentioned before, it wasn't uncommon for a doctor to become disabled. So in the early 1900s, there are several accounts in journals like the Journal of the American Medical Association of reaching out to fellow physicians to give charitable donations or establish some sort of benevolent housing fund for physicians who become disabled. But it's typically framed around charity and ways of sort of incorporating them into the profession, but also helping them be financially supported as they're going through this major life change. And then things sort of start to change a little bit in the 1950s as there's more exposure to what does it mean for a physician to become a patient. And there was this book from the 1950s called When Doctors Are Patients. And this book talks about what happens when a doctor develops breast cancer or multiple sclerosis or is in an accident and becomes quadriplegic, for example. So these stories sort of show that this is happening in the profession, and a lot of the stories highlight that when a physician is in a situation where they become a patient, they find that it makes them ultimately a more empathetic physician because they understand what contributes to good bedside manner and what is reassuring to hear, what you want to hear, what you don't want to hear as a patient. So this is a theme that came up again and again throughout my interviews with these different physicians. They're saying their disability and experience of being a patient made them a better doctor because they had been through the experience themselves. They knew what it was like to be scared, to have uncertainty, and to then sort of work through that with someone who is in this position who you ultimately are trusting with your medical care. So then several people with mobility disabilities began to apply to medical school in the 1960s, specifically Julie Medorsky and Thomas Strax, who are discussed in my article. I was not able to interview Dr. Strax, but I was able to interview Dr. Medorsky, and she was incredibly helpful for also connecting me with other physicians with mobility disabilities, which ultimately became the sort of focus of my essay. So they applied in the 1960s, and it seemed that because they were not using a wheelchair, and Dr. Medorsky had a limp, and Dr. Strax, he had various mobility disabilities, but I believe at the time was not using a wheelchair. The medical schools, they faced some pushback from medical schools. For example, Dr. Strax was initially, it seemed that several schools in New York were not open to accepting him, and then ultimately he wanted to go to NYU and was able to go with the support of a rehabilitation physician who helped advocate for him. But they ultimately were able to gain admission to medical school and become successful practicing doctors. And they both really emphasized their capabilities and what they could accomplish. And with relatively minor accommodations, were able to complete all of the medical school curriculum that was required of them. So then in the 1970s, as disability activism is rising up, the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 stated that there would not be allowed to be discrimination on the basis of disabilities. This was one of the first major pieces of disability civil rights legislation and banned discrimination. So this act sort of changed the legal landscape of how these applicants were interacting with medical schools. And the first situation in which this received a test was with the case of Southeastern Community College v. Davis, which ultimately was a Supreme Court case surrounding a nursing student named Frances Davis who applied to medical school with a she applied to nursing school, with a hearing disability and ultimately was rejected because of her disability. The nursing school said, if she is not able to hear and we have to undergo all of these accommodations, then she won't be able to effectively perform her job and meet the functions of the program of becoming a nurse who's able to effectively communicate. And she said, well, the Rehabilitation Act protects me and I shouldn't be able to be discriminated against. And with accommodations, I'm able to meet the functions of the program. So this decision worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, which unanimously ruled in favor of the nursing school. And so she was ultimately rejected from the nursing school. However, while this process was happening, the Association of American Medical Colleges, which I mentioned earlier, started to get involved in this legal battle and put forward several amicus briefs, and even in 1979 published this important document stating that medical schools, in order to protect themselves from liability and also to have some sort of standard guiding them when approaching issues of applicants with disabilities, that they should implement what are called technical standards, stating the physical requirements that every medical school applicant should have. So it applied for all sorts of different disabilities. And in my paper, I'm looking specifically at physical disabilities and then specifically mobility disabilities and people in wheelchairs, which I should have mentioned before is my focus because of both my previous interest in wheelchair and disability activism, but also because of the sort of consistent accommodations that are made across people with mobility disabilities compared to someone with hearing loss or someone with vision loss, for example, which require very different types of accommodations based on types of disability. And even within individuals who use wheelchairs, there's a huge range in terms of different ability levels and use of arms and function of hands and dexterity. So anyways, the Association of American Medical Colleges put forth these standards saying that if you're applying to medical school, you should have to be able to perform CPR, deliver a baby, stabilize an elderly patient. And several of the tasks that they put forward under the category of motor function were the types of tasks that someone in a wheelchair could not perform. So while someone in a wheelchair could, even if they did not have full use of their arms, go into radiology or psychiatry or any sort of profession that required them to converse with patients but not perform some fine motor function type of skill, these standards stated, well, medical school should be able to reject those applicants because they could not go into every possible medical specialty. They would be limited in terms of the specialties that they would be able to go into. So I became interested in why did the Association of American Medical Colleges come up with these standards and why did they even get involved in this battle that at the time seemed to be affecting nursing schools, and it wasn't even clear that it was going to somehow force them to start accepting applicants with disabilities, even though not many seemed to be applying. So it seems that the history was very useful here to answer this question, and in my essay, I sort of follow two different threads, one of which is the origins of this concept of the undifferentiated physician, that every physician should be able to perform every medical task, almost as if they were practicing in a rural healthcare setting in an emergency room department. And so if someone fell on the floor and they needed to perform CPR, they should be ready to do it. And so this concept traces back to World War I and the history of specialization and early debates that happened in the 1900s about the importance of generalist practitioners. And so as World War I was happening and then World War II, and specialization was increasing during several of the wars, and there were shortages of physicians. This is a huge simplification generally, but there was more need for physicians who could do everything. And then ultimately pushback and the trend towards specialization made it so that it made sense to divide and conquer more. And so in the 1950s, 1960s, you start to see more and more medical specialties rising, and it makes sense for physicians to become medical specialists. Yet as these different waves of specialization are happening, there's ultimately pushback, and there are individuals who are advocating for the importance of generalist practice again and again. And so even there's this report from 1950 from American Surgical Association that says I will find the quote. They said that medical education should give the student a comprehensive concept of man and his diseases, and to inculcate those habits of mind which will enable him to enter, without handicap, any one of the fields of medical practice and research, be it medicine, surgery, psychiatry, or public health. So this was a report from the American Surgical Association that was published in 1950 and was written by them in an effort to incorporate surgery into the practice of medicine and emphasize its importance in a sort of effort for professional unification. But presumably they were not talking about handicap in the sense of disability, but they were talking about it in terms of limitations and the ability to perform any task. But it's kind of ironic given how this report itself was used and cited by the Association of American Medical Colleges in order to justify these technical standards. So the exact language of this report shows up 29 years later in 1979 when the AAMC publishes their report saying that we should have undifferentiated physicians who are able to engage in any form of medical practice. So the other thread that provides insight into why the AAMC responded like they did was the history of medical school exclusions. And there's a long history of discrimination based on race, gender, religion, and various hospital systems. And even when reform measures were met, and to try to make the profession more inclusive, and even into the 1970s, you start to see affirmative action on the basis of race and gender. You see less of it in less inclusion along lines of disability. So those are sort of insight into why the AAMC reacted as they did, which traces through the end of the 1970s, which is the main focus of this article. And then my essay concludes by focusing on stories of applicants who applied during the 1970s, were incredibly successful, and some of these applicants actually were in wheelchairs themselves. And for them, when I talked to them about their experiences, having a disability did not play a huge factor into their admissions process at all. They were an incredibly qualified applicant. They worked hard, they had grades, they had done their research, they had checked all the boxes. And then when they went to their interviews, they didn't emphasize the things that they couldn't do, but rather emphasized all of their qualifications and abilities to perform despite using a wheelchair and despite not maybe being able to perform CPR, these various functions. So because of the nature of my research, there were not a lot of people who I was able to find who applied to medical school and were rejected because of their disability and then vanished without a trace. Likely those people just went on to different careers. But even the physicians who were incredibly successful and were able to go into medical school, they faced barriers along the way of admissions officers who told them at some schools that they couldn't do it, or even when they were able to ultimately become a doctor, some of them faced discrimination in terms of bias from their fellow practitioners, or even hospital rooms that were inaccessible that they were not able to navigate, especially in the 1970s. So this policy put forward by the AAMC, or this standard, these reports that stated that medical schools should implement technical standards, they still exist. And as recently as in 2011, there was a student who applied to the University of Kansas School of Medicine, and she was in a wheelchair, was accepted to the University of Kansas School of Medicine. And then she submitted a request for accommodation saying that she would not be able to meet several of the technical standard functions that were put forward by the school. And so she would not be able to stabilize elderly patients, she would not be able to perform CPR, but otherwise she could perform all the other medical tasks on their technical standards. And the University of Kansas School of Medicine then rescinded her acceptance. And ultimately, this became a legal case, and courts, despite several appeals, ruled in favor of the medical school, saying that the medical school, despite the Rehabilitation Act saying that discrimination was not allowed on the basis of disability, the medical school could have essential functions that they put forward. And if an applicant did not meet these essential functions, it was okay for the school to be able to reject them because of their disabilities. And even after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which really strengthened the Rehabilitation Act and had a lot of the same principles of non-discrimination on the basis of disability and aimed to make public life a lot more accessible, these technical standards have persisted. And throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the bigger project that I've been working on, sort of following up on this essay, is how does this play out with more applicants? And you see more stories start to emerge in the 1980s and 1990s of applicants who are sometimes rejected because explicitly of their disability, and take different avenues in order to reconcile that. Sometimes they apply again, sometimes they take their battle to court, and even in the 1990s, there's a case of an applicant who takes his case to national television in order to sort of expose this injustice, and is saying there are many types of doctors that I could be despite not being able to be a neurosurgeon potentially. But even though I don't have fine motor movement with my fingers, I have the ability to be a radiologist, a psychiatrist, an internal medicine doctor. There are so many types of medicine that I can do, and that I have a lot to offer because of my unique experience being a patient myself. So that's sort of a theme that comes up again and again. So I also am interested in bias more that persists throughout the profession as opposed to just on the admission side, and certainly would also be interested in the experiences of individuals applying with hearing disabilities or vision disabilities throughout this as well. That was just beyond the scope of the project, and there's also a huge area of discrimination and policy, court cases, and experiences that are about individuals with maybe intellectual disabilities or different sort of disabilities as well. But the focus of my project was on physical disabilities, just to narrow its scope and because it fit with the sort of types of accommodations that I was interested in looking at. So that's sort of my journey of how I became interested in this topic and came to write this essay. Thank you all for listening to me, and I am excited for any questions that you have.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Gordon. That's it's very interesting research, and you presented very well. Dr. Cordova Salinas had a comment about the definition of disabilities being quite wide, and emphasizing that you're talking about physical disabilities, which you mentioned quite a bit. But as people are typing in their questions in the chat, I would like to start, if I could. How do you think your research, this historical research, will help you will help inform you as a physician? I mean, my argument as an historian is that history is the foundation of all knowledge, and so will inform really any field of study. I'm just curious, after this experience, how do you think it'll inform your work as a future physician?
That's a great question. And I've definitely been thinking about this as I'm starting medical school and also figuring out how to continue with my interest in disability advocacy. I think one of the main lessons that I've learned throughout this entire process is just really to not make assumptions about just because of what you see someone is looks like or what their ability status is, what their life has been like, or what challenges they faced. And a lot of the time I expected to talk to these individuals with disabilities or individuals in wheelchairs and hear about the discrimination they faced and how challenging their lives were. And that's just how I sort of imagined and assumed it would be, since society in so many ways is inaccessible. Yet I heard some stories about struggles and discrimination and bias, but I also heard a lot of stories about just like growing up like anyone who was not in a wheelchair and being interested in medicine because the person I was interviewing really wanted to help people and make a difference. And the more stories that I heard like that, it really just resonated with me and just really reminded me that just because someone has a certain physical ability level, it doesn't mean anything about what their capabilities are or what sort of hardships they've experienced. And so that's definitely something that I really try to carry with me as I'm starting to interact with patients and think about my medical career, is just to really avoid making assumptions and being really open-minded, because there's a huge span of ability level, and it's not even a simple binary between ability and disability. And so this has helped me develop a more nuanced understanding and avoid assuming about someone's experiences or past. So I think that's one component of it. And another component of it is that this story has certainly made me want to create change and advocate more for people with disabilities. And so I'm in some ways that manifests itself in terms of like volunteering and at this equestrian facility I was mentioning earlier, and also potentially engaging more academically with this topic, and maybe looking to turn this into an article or more of a long-term project. But I think it's important, and I'm still figuring out how to engage with it and where I want to go and how to make a difference. But it's definitely something that I think is incredibly important on a policy level, historical level, social level.
Yeah, very good. Um, uh, One of our librarians, Terry Lynn, has commented she knows of two faculty here at MEOC that practice medicine um, in peds and physical occupational therapy, and they practice from wheelchairs, um, which is good for MEOC, I guess.
Yeah,
Also,
absolutely.
uh, yeah.
I was gonna just say that I think that it's interesting how many of these physicians practice in wheelchairs, either because they were in a wheelchair when they were applying, or more commonly encounter some sort of an accident or a situation where they start to use a wheelchair later in their careers. Yet it's still so much in sort of common knowledge. And when you think about physicians, so rarely do you think about a physician in a wheelchair. And there are several articles from the 1980s that show pictures on their cover of a physician practicing in a wheelchair, and there's this sort of strangeness factor to it, of it feels so unusual. And then you read these accounts of physicians who are practicing in wheelchairs, and sometimes people come up to them and say, like, are you a patient, are you lost? And to me, that really just shows how deeply ingrained a lot of this bias is, and assumptions about what it means to be a physician. Even at the beginning of this essay, that I submitted is the story of someone who is a physician in charge of a rehabilitation hospital, basically, like the assistant medical director, who pretends for a patient interview to be a patient himself and lets medical students examine him and assess his ability level. And after a whole examination, the students say, well, if you're lucky, you could sell a pencil. And that's the conclusion that they come to after interviewing this man who they don't know at the time, but is the assistant medical director of a rehabilitation hospital and like an incredibly successful physician. So I think then those students very much learned their lesson about not making assumptions. But I think it's great to hear about and interesting to think about why you don't see or hear about it and why it's not your go-to image of a physician.
Yeah, so historically, also that I think it's interesting how uh, the um, uh, the uh, uh, the act in the 1990s that makes this discrimination, um, illegal, and we have public facilities changing access, and in many cases, not really understanding what that access really should be versus what the law or the guidelines say it should be. I found many examples of the building has an accommodation, but it's really not very accommodating. And so, in your research, have you come across any of that yet, or is that something you want to explore? The really has the American Disabilities Act, um, certainly it's made changes, it's caused changes in access to public facilities, but is it really very accommodating? I mean, we still have doors that are heavy, ramps that are very steep or narrow, things like that make it difficult. And so I know this is kind of a side issue of your research, but did you come across that kind of example?
Yeah, that's a great question. So definitely, it came up in several instances, even starting in the 1970s and 1980s, when you do have more social pressure and also legislation that's coming out to make buildings and environments more accessible. One of the physicians who I interviewed was saying that there were major efforts while he was going through his clinical portion of his training to make hospitals more accessible, but those efforts were even made to make hospitals more accessible to patients. They hadn't considered how to make hospitals more accessible to physicians who are practicing in wheelchairs. And so while they were starting to make maybe elevators a little wider or incorporate more technology, the nurses' stations that he had to navigate around were still inaccessible. And the patient rooms, a lot of the time, he wasn't able to access the equipment that he needed to perform an effective physical exam. And so that's one component of it. And then I think you said it very well. The ADA accomplished a lot, the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also left a lot yet to be done. And there are definitely, I think, the more that I've read about the history and have worked on this project continuing into the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, I've really seen how this is a very clear example of how there's a loophole in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is meant to make education, for example, accessible, and yet medical schools still retain this authority to discriminate on the basis of disability. And they don't have to, and they haven't, because in all instances, because of these incredibly qualified and capable physicians. But in some instances they have, and they have the authority to, which is, I think, very significant from a policy standpoint. But I am really interested in physical accommodations and spaces. And I think that's also part of why I'm especially interested in wheelchairs, because of some of the medical technology with them. And now there are lowered examination tables that allow not only patients in wheelchairs to be able to get on an examination table more easily, but also allow a physician in a wheelchair to perform a full physical exam at just a slightly lower elevation level. And there are standing wheelchairs that enable physicians in wheelchairs to practice surgery at different angles and be able to look over the patient if they need to. So as the technology is improving and even the legislation seems to be improving, there still seems to be this sort of gap where there's still inaccessibility and still sort of implicit discrimination and explicit discrimination in the profession.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. And it's interesting that you bring up technology. Oops, sorry. Bringing up technology and the impact of technology on really better serving patients, but also allowing physicians to treat their patients, like telehealth. And you could even, I know of examples of surgeons giving advice while surgery is occurring, or really guidance through kind of a telehealth type of setup, where the surgeon isn't actually doing the surgery, but is telling someone how to do it, where to cut, what to look for, and so on. So potentially that you could even have a surgeon who has a physical disability, is not really doing the actual physical surgery, but is really guiding someone on how to conduct the surgery.
Absolutely, definitely. And so I think that's a great example. It's been interesting to think about from my own experience starting medical school remotely. There's no physical component of my education. And if someone was in a wheelchair or not in a wheelchair, when they're conducting a telehealth visit, you don't even necessarily know anything about their ability level. So I wonder if that will play any sort of a role, because that's I think one of the things that's challenging to me is, well, if you do have as less and less of medical training, if it becomes less physically demanding, or as technology improves even more, and you're not dealing with a situation where in the 1950s, medical students and residents have to run up and down the stairs really quickly to get from patient to patient. It seems that physical ability, in a sense, matters less, and then in some areas matters not at all. So, but then it's interesting for me to consider, like, well, what does that mean for medical education, and how do you sort of generalize that principle? Should you generalize that principle? Should we have it be someone, if they could just become a psychiatrist, then in terms of their medical specialty ability, how does that impact medical education? So I think there are some interesting and important arguments on both sides, and but that's why I think history is really important, because the way that these standards arose were really shaped by the context of the 1950s and history of specialization and this specific Supreme Court case and battles over authority and who controls who enters the profession.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we have another comment about the history of activism in Charleston. In the 80s, there was a lawyer who would check out restaurants and public buildings and regarding accessibility, and actually published a book about it. So this isn't just a new issue or new topic, or there, as you pointed out, there are people who have been activists and kind of pushing against these limitations for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a great point. And there's also the whole world of discrimination in law school admissions, and then other areas also. My focus is on medical school, and then also, because of this case, a little bit less, but nursing school. But what about dental school, and what about other health profession areas as well, where I'm sure there is a very rich story to be told?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to thank you again for presenting to us, and for submitting your essay to us. As I mentioned, the committee editorial committee really enjoyed reading your essay, and really we enjoyed talking about it as well, and your conclusions and the kind of research you did with the primary research that you did. So well done, and I want to wish you well in your future exploration of this topic, and I hope you continue to do that, even if you have to put it on pause to do your to engage in your medical studies adequately. But I also want to wish you luck in medical school, and maybe someday when we have an intention to publish all the essays we gather in the next couple of years for our bicentennial celebration here at the university, and put them all together. So maybe we'll be able to connect again, and by that time we'll be able to do it in person. So
That would be wonderful. I look forward to that day. And thank you so much for having me and for these thoughtful comments. And I really enjoyed talking to all of you. So I'm so grateful for this opportunity. So thank you so much.
yeah, you're welcome. So with that, we'll end the presentation, and take care. Thanks again.